Hey guys, as you can see on your screen, this is your do now for Friday 10-4. So this should be the first do now in your new Unit 2 packet. Make a conjecture based on the given information. Angle 1 and angle 2 form a right angle. Remember, a conjecture requires a statement as well as a picture. Hit pause now and complete the do now. So if it says angle 1 and angle 2 form a right angle, make yourself a picture. Draw yourself a right angle, break it into two angles, angle 1, angle 2. So what do we know about angle 1 and angle 2? You could tell me angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 90 degrees, whether you write it as an equation or you write it as a whole sentence. You can tell me that angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. You could tell me they are complementary, right? You only need one of these options, but just again showing that there are multiple conjectures you can make. So as long as you have one of them, you are good to go. You should have completed page 6. If you haven't, that's okay. I'm not checking it for credit until Monday. That's also when we'll go over the homework answers. So for now, I need you to flip to your packet, page 7. We're going to cover conditional statements today. So on page 7, a conditional statement is a statement that can be written in if-then form. When we have things that are written in if-then form, they're broken into two parts, a hypothesis and a conclusion. Hypothesis is the part of our sentence that follows the word if. Conclusion is the part of our sentence that follows the word then. Notice that for both hypothesis and conclusion, it says it follows. That means that the words if and then are not included as part of your hypothesis and conclusion. If at any point during this video you need more time to write what is on your screen, remember you can pause. So if you need more time, hit pause now. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the first examples. Identify the hypothesis and conclusion in each statement. If a polygon has 6 sides, then it is a hexagon. So if I'm identifying the hypothesis, it is the part of the sentence that follows the word if. So don't include the word if. I'm going to take my sentence basically until I hit the word then. This is my hypothesis. For my conclusion, I'm going to skip the word then, and I'm going to take basically the rest of the sentence. So notice again, if and then are not included. Sentence 2 says the Tigers will play in the tournament if they win their next game. So sometimes my sentence is sort of in if-then form, but kind of out of order. You still want to find your word if, and what follows the word if is still going to be our hypothesis. Okay, I'll abbreviate a little bit. Your conclusion then is the other portion of the sentence. Even if it doesn't involve the word then, the Tigers will play in the tournament is going to be my conclusion. Okay, so if it's an if-then form, the order could be different. You might only have an if and not a then, but we still get what we need. We're going to skip the fact that number 3 is blank, and we're going to move on to the next part. Write each statement in if-then form. When you're writing your own if-then form statement, you don't want to change the order of things too dramatically. You sort of want to insert the word if and then, but you might need to insert a few extra words so that your sentence is going to make grammatical sense. Otherwise, sentences could be very awkward and not actually read functionally. I am by far no means an English teacher. If I can tell your sentence sounds weird, that means it sounds weird, okay? So question 4 says, penguins are birds that cannot fly. So I know I'm going to want to start with if. But we need to make sure that we're not questioning something that's true. I don't want to say if penguins are birds. I know penguins are birds. I'm not questioning that, right? So instead of keeping that order, what if I say if a bird is a penguin? Meaning that bird that I'm looking at is a penguin. Then it cannot fly. Okay, so I didn't question whether penguins were birds. I'm questioning if the bird I'm looking at is a penguin, then I know it cannot fly. So take a moment and try number 5. 5 says complementary angles add to 90 degrees. So hit pause and try number 5. Okay, so as you can see, I put an answer up for number 5. If angles are complementary, then they add to 90 degrees. So again, swapped kind of 2 words so that things made a little bit more sense as I read it. If angles are complementary, then they add to 90. What I don't want us to do is completely flip the front and back of a sentence. So please do not say if angles add to 90, then they are complementary. We want to try and keep the general order of the sentence, okay, in terms of sort of what's the start of the sentence and what's the end of the sentence. But we can arrange things slightly differently as we need to. Part of the reason we don't want to do a complete front and back flip-flop is that's actually leading us into the next portion. We have what are known as conditional statements, these if-thens, but we also have converse, inverse, and contrapositive, which are different ways to take and work with these if-then statements. So this part is asking you to create the rules for how to write the following statements from the conditional based on the given example. So if the conditional says if 2 lines are perpendicular, then they form right angles. The converse sentence says if 2 lines form right angles, then they are perpendicular. So what you should notice is they have taken the front and back of the sentence, the hypothesis and the conclusion, and they have switched them. So that is our role for writing the converse. We want to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, for each one of these, we're referencing back to the original conditional. So if I look at inverse, if the original conditional says if 2 lines are perpendicular, then they form right angles. And now my inverse says if 2 lines are not perpendicular, then they do not form right angles. So notice my sentence is all in the same order, from conditional to inverse. The order of everything is the same. The only difference is now in the inverse, they've inserted those words not. So you can phrase this how you want. I say that we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion, meaning I make it negative. I put in things like nots. If it already had a word like not, you would take it out. You basically want it to do the opposite. Okay, so I say negate the hypothesis and conclusion. One more, it's called the contrapositive. So again, the original conditional statement says if 2 lines are perpendicular, then they form right angles. Now all the way down to my contrapositive, if 2 lines do not form right angles, then they are not perpendicular. So basically, I've taken the converse and the inverse and I'm doing them both. Notice that my front and backs have switched and I have the word nots. So some people say that they take the inverse and they switch it, or you can simply say to do both, switch and negate the hypothesis and conclusion. So swap their places and make them negative. If you need more time with this, hit pause now. So let's look at an example. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the conditional. If 2 angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So what I'd like you to do is I want you to take a moment and try and write the 3 sentences, converse, inverse, and contrapositive, using the rules we just wrote on the front. So hit pause and write your sentences now. So hopefully we've written our sentences. Let's run through what they are. Original says if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So my converse means I should switch hypothesis and conclusion. I said if two angles are supplementary, then they form a linear pair. Notice I kept the two angles part in the front. You can keep a little bit of context, because if not, you're going to say if they are supplementary. Well, what's they? What are we even talking about? So really, you want to switch sort of that key vocab for the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if two angles are supplementary, then they form a linear pair. I've switched that core key vocab or context of the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if I keep going with the inverse, now I want to make it negative. If two angles do not form a linear pair, then they are not supplementary. And finally, contrapositive, I'm going to do both. If two angles are not supplementary, then they do not form a linear pair. If you need more time with the sentences, go ahead and hit pause now. Otherwise, what we're looking to do is add to this. We want to add in part of what we did yesterday in terms of counterexamples. What we've done is we've made these statements. So how can we now determine if each statement is true or false? And if false, give a counterexample. So much like the given and conjecture statements from yesterday, your hypothesis or your if, that's our given. That part is going to be true. You are deciding if that makes the conclusion true 100% of the time. So if I go back up the original sentence, if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. And we need to decide, is that true or false? Well, linear pairs make straight lines that add to 180. I would say the original sentence is true. So now my converse, if two angles are supplementary, then they form a linear pair. Well, some supplementary angles will form a linear pair, but not all. So we're going to say this is false. And we can say the angles can be, how about non-adjacent? Right? They might not be touching. They can be separate. You can explain it how you want, but the point is they don't have to form a straight line. They can be separate angles. So if I take the same approach then to the inverse, if two angles do not form a linear pair, then they are not supplementary. Well, no, we just said that they might not be adjacent, but they can still be supplementary. So we can say false angles can be non-adjacent again. Right? The whole point is they don't have to be next to each other just to add to 180 degrees. Oftentimes, whatever you put as your false counterexample, if you have another false, it typically also works. So telling me they're not adjacent, telling me they can be separate angles, all of those things are valid. The last one then, if two angles are not supplementary, then they do not form a linear pair. So what this is saying is those angles are absolutely not adding to 180 degrees. Well, guess what? If they do not add to 180, they do not make a linear pair. That makes it true. I will be honest, it is not uncommon for the original and the contrapositive to have matching trues or falses, and for converse and inverse to have matching trues or falses. So it does sort of pair off in that way quite normally. I'd like you guys to do all of the bottom question. Write all 4 sentences and go through and decide if each sentence is true or false. So hit pause on the video and do the whole bottom question. All right, guys, here's your answers to the bottom questions. If you need time with these, hit pause so that you can read through them. The important thing is they are all true. It is possible for them all to be true or all to be false for that matter. And so once you're good on these, last bit, you are taking care of page 9 as your homework. Don't forget about page 6 either. See you Monday.